He spent 40 years living in invisibility. He had some sheep. He lived in a desert. And then one day he found himself standing in front of the most powerful man in all the world. And he was saying, "Let my people go." The man's name was Moses. And Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The Jewish people called that book the Torah. They followed his writings and his laws and his principles. And for 1,450 years, Moses was their man. But 1,450 years after Moses lived, came a man on the scene. He was known as the Son of Man. He called himself the Messiah. And he said to the people, "Follow me." And so the battle was over. Who are we going to follow? We're going to follow the law of Moses, or we're going to follow this man, Jesus. So I think it would be beneficial for us to do a flyby on the story of Moses and compare him with Jesus. First of all, Moses came from royalty. Pharaoh didn't like how the population of the Hebrews was growing, and so he decided he was going to have all the baby boys killed. Moses' mother made a wicker basket and made it waterproof and hid Moses in the reeds in the Nile River. Pharaoh's daughter was down bathing in the river and found the baby, and she took him and raised him as her son in royalty. 40 years later, Moses takes justice into his own hands, and he kills an Egyptian who's abusing one of the Hebrews. And Moses runs for his life, and he's in the desert where he spends the next 40 years. And one day he sees a bush that's on fire, and it's not being consumed, so he goes over to investigate it, and out of the bush comes the voice of God, and God says to him, "Take off your shoes. You're standing on holy ground. I want you to go back to Pharaoh, and I want you to tell him to let my people go." So Moses says, "Who do I say sent me?" And God said, "I am sent you." And I am is sort of picks up everything that God is, okay? There's no way to describe it. But he's saying, I am all powerful. I'm all knowing. I'm everywhere all the time. I'm everything you're ever going to need. I am spoke to you. And he told Pharaoh. And Pharaoh didn't listen. God sent plagues. And finally Pharaoh let the people go. Moses goes up on a mountain to meet with God. There's lightning and thunder and smoke covering the mountain. There's sounds of trumpet blasting. And God is speaking to Moses. And God gives Moses his commands. And he brings those commandments down to the people of God. Now there are about 1.5 million to 2 million of these people. And they run out of rations. And the people begin to complain because they're going to starve to death. And Moses goes to God and asks God for food. And they wake up in the morning, there's Pop-Tarts all over the ground. They called Pop-Tarts manna back then. And they collected this manna every day. They weren't allowed to collect more than they could eat that day because leftovers spoiled quickly and it would make people sick. So every evening the people had to have faith that the Pop-Tarts would be there in the morning. And the people of Israel, they fled Egypt. And when they fled Egypt, they walked between the 2 mountain ranges. And then they walked right up to the edge of the Red Sea. And they were hemmed in. And Pharaoh's soldiers were on hot pursuit. And they were sitting ducks. And of course the people complained. And Moses takes his staff and raises it up over the Red Sea. And miraculously the Red Sea splits in half. And there's dry ground underneath that water. And 2 million Hebrews walk across the Red Sea on dry ground. Pharaoh's army arrives. They see what's happened. They think they can do the same thing. They go down and they get halfway through. and the walls of the Red Sea collapse, and the people of Pharaoh's military are drowned. And so God set his Hebrew people free and killed their enemy. And one day Moses requested that he would see God. He wanted to see God. And God agrees to let him see him, but he says, you can't see my face. So he puts him in the cleft of a rock, and he sort of puts his hand in front of Moses' face so he won't completely see him. And then God walks past Moses, and Moses gets to see the glory of God pass him by. And the people of Israel, they remember that story, and they say that their prophet, the greatest prophet who ever lived, was the prophet that was able to see the glory of God passing by. Moses leads them to the entrance of the promised land, a land flowing with tremendous resources, something better than they ever had in Egypt. But they had griped and complained the whole way. No matter what God did, they griped and complained. Parting the Red Sea, Pop-Tarts every morning, quail for dinner. They ran out of water, so God had a rock struck and water came out of the rock. And the rock followed them all throughout the wilderness, providing the water they needed every day of their life. But their hearts were hardened. Well, Moses gave them the law. And he told them to follow the law and live. And they had held on to those laws for 1,450 years. And then Jesus shows up. And Jesus says, listen to me and follow me. So after Jesus has healed multitudes, after he makes a lame man walk, after he heals a woman with the issue of blood, after he raises Jairus' daughter from the dead, after he stills the storms and the wind and the waves obey him, after he drives out a legion of demons from this demon-possessed man, after he feeds 5,000 men and their wives and their children with 5 little barley loaves and 2 dried fishes, after he clearly tells the people in his hometown that he is the Messiah talked about in Isaiah 61, they know who he is. His name's Jesus. They know what he's done, his miracles. But no one has the faith to believe that he is the Son of God, the Messiah, God standing right in front of them. No one believes it. Now, Mark, he poses that question a couple times. When Jesus stills the storm and the waves obey, it says the disciples say, who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? And then the people listening to him teach, they say, who is this man who is able to speak with such authority? They're asking the same question. Who is this man? But they don't get it. Now I want us to go back to the story that leads up to the text we're going to look at this morning. You say, we're going to look at a long time. Real short on the text. The disciples needed rest, so they went to a solitary place where Jesus took them. Crowds had gathered. Jesus taught them for hours, and then Jesus decided they wanted to feed them. But there's 5,000 men and their wives and the children, and he feeds them with 5 little barley loaves and 2 dried fishes. The disciples are then gathering up the scraps, and they fill 12 baskets full of fragments of bread and fish. They're holding in their hand an object lesson. God is saying to them through Jesus and what he did, remember the miracle of the bread in the wilderness? Who did that miracle? Now you're holding a miracle of the bread in the desert. Who did that miracle? It was time to drive it home. They should have got it by then. It should have clicked. This man is God standing in front of us. And Jesus is going to drive it home with this next miracle. We pick it up in Mark chapter 6, 45 to 54. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. If you go to John, it says, after the people saw the signs Jesus performed, they began saying, surely this is the prophet who is the one to come into the world. Jesus, knowing they intended to come and make him king by force, he says, gang, it's not going to go down this way. This is not my mission right now. Go home. Verse 46. After leaving them, he went up to the mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake. He was not alone on the land. He was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. And when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. And they were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. You know, before Jesus walked on water that night, I wonder if Jesus remembered what was written in Job. Job 9 says this, he alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He is the maker of the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades, and the constellations of the south. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. And when he passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive him. I wonder if Jesus actually set this moment up. Jesus hopes they're ready. And so he goes off to the boat, walking on the water. And they're terrified. He's going to pass them by. I think they literally, as he was passing them by, he was trying to say to them, you are watching the glory of God. I am the glory of God. But they're terrified, and so he stops and he says, it's me, take courage. He gets in the boat. They're amazed, but they still don't get who he is. Why? Because their hearts are hardened. They were insensitive to the truth that Jesus was God because their hearts were hardened. They knew Jesus was in the boat with them. They knew he was a great prophet, but they didn't know who Jesus was, who was in his boat. It didn't sink in. Now, let's compare Moses with Jesus. Jesus is royalty. In Mark 2, some people cut a hole in the roof and they lowered a paralyzed man in front of him. And Jesus looks at the man and says, your sins are forgiven. And the people in the crowd go, oh, wait a second. Only God can forgive sins. And Jesus says, you're right. What's easier to do, forgive sins or tell this guy to get up and walk? And he says, to let you know that the Son of Man, and he points to himself, has the power to forgive sins. He says to the man, get up and walk. And the guy gets up and goes home. He's royalty. He said to them right then, I am the Son of Man. I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God. Moses was sold Tell them, I am sent you. Jesus at least 8 times says, I am. One of the times that people come to him and he says, before Abraham was, I am. And immediately the leaders knew he claimed to be God because they wanted to put him to death. Moses was sent to deliver people. Jesus was sent to deliver the people. Moses spent time in the mountain. Jesus spent time in the mountain hearing from his Father. And Jesus speaks God's words. Moses delivered God's words, but Jesus spoke them. Moses gave God's law about leprosy. Jesus speaks and cures leprosy. Moses gave God's law about protection about blood. Jesus heals a woman with the issue of blood and tells her that her faith has made her whole. Moses gave the law about handling the dead. Jesus speaks to a little girl and raises her from the dead. And Moses prayed for bread, and Jesus created bread. And this should have pushed the disciples over the line to where they would believe that he was truly the I am. Not just I am a prophet, but I am God who has invaded the earth. Look what I am doing. Moses made the water part. Jesus created the water and walked on it. Only God pulls that off. God passed by Moses. Jesus was going to pass by the disciples. Jesus is right now setting up eternal promised land for you and for me. And just like the people of Moses' day, the disciples had hard hearts. They were amazed at everything that Jesus said, everything that Jesus did, but they didn't get it, that Jesus was God. They didn't understand the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes because their hearts were hardened. Now, you always look at the disciples as the people you want to emulate. From this point on, you do not want to pattern your life after the disciples because it gets worse. From this point on, the disciples show you that this journey they're on with Jesus, they think is all about them. From this point on, they don't understand any of the parables that Jesus teaches. From this point on, Jesus says to them, you have eyes to see, but you can't see. You have ears to hear, but you can't hear. And they go, huh? From this point on, the disciples show their heart. They begin to debate with each other who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. James and John, who are twins, they come to Jesus and they say, we want to be number 1 and 2. And Jesus says, you don't have any idea what you're asking. And they say, oh yeah, we do. Our mother asked us to ask you that we could be number 1 and 2. We know what we're talking about. And by the end of Jesus' ministry, they're walking into Jerusalem. And every one of the disciples said, if you're going into Jerusalem to die, we'll die with you. And as soon as he's handed over to be executed, they all leave. One comes back to curse him 3 times, and one goes out and commits suicide. All this is because they have hard hearts. I want you to understand something. They didn't get it yet. Because they had hard hearts. Okay, now here's the question. What are the lessons from the loaves? 2 lessons. Number 1, a hardened heart belongs to any follower that thinks Christianity is all about me. That Jesus is in my boat to bless me, to answer my prayers, and to guide me. Remember, the disciples were amazed at what Jesus was teaching up to chapter 6. His miracles were awesome. The crowd was amazed at his teaching and his miracles, but they were all in it for themselves, what they could get out of it, because their hearts were hardened. And because their hearts were hardened, and it was all about me, they couldn't fathom that this Jesus was God. See, Christianity is all about God invading the earth to save us from our sin, so that we can walk alongside of him and be part of what he is doing. Joshua chapter 5. I'm going to read it for you, verse 13 to 15. Now it came about when Joshua was in Jericho, he raised his eyes and looked, and beheld, a man was standing opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" He said, "No. Rather, I have come now as captain of the army of the Lord." Joshua fell on his face to the ground and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Joshua is about to take the city of Jericho. He runs into a man holding a sword. He asks him whose side he's on. He said, "I'm not on anybody's side. I'm the captain of the Lord's army." Joshua falls on the ground and hears this man say, "Take off your sandals. You're standing on holy ground." I'm sure Joshua remembered Moses heard the same thing when he was at the bush. Joshua knew at that moment the commander was no other than God himself. And Joshua was asked by God to join God in what God was about to do in Jericho and the rest of the promised land. Moses, he takes off his sandals. He hears the word of God, and God invites Moses to be part of what God is about to do in delivering his people. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, "I'm God. I'm inviting you to be part of what I am doing." And the disciples missed it. And from chapter 6 on, it gets worse. And it becomes obvious that they think that Jesus has come to bless them. Now, don't get me wrong. God does bless us. But it's more important for you and me to realize he doesn't want to just bless us. He's inviting us to come alongside of him and do what he is doing in the world. Come alongside of him. An open heart says, "You are God. You are my life. My life, my day, my job, my family, my relationships are all to honor you. It's your show, not mine. You walk on water, I don't." He's inviting you and me to be part of what he's doing in the world. Every day we need to ask the question, how do I give glory to the Lord? How did I give glory to the Lord? How did I honor the Lord today? How did I bring praise to the Lord? Remember, and Heather, you said something in your testimony. You said from this point on, in changing your life, you were all in. All in. That's what Mark's all about. He wants people to follow Jesus, but he wants people to realize that Jesus isn't just a man. He is God himself. And God is saying to us, come and get all in following me. Let's have a word of prayer, and then let's stand and sing the Lord's Prayer. But before we sing the Lord's Prayer, just a thought ran through my mind. How does it begin? What's it say? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Keep going. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's not about me. It's about him. Lord, you saved us from our sin, which is amazing. And we're forgiven, and we're part of your family, and we're yours forever. But you want us to go all in and come alongside of you and do what you're doing in the world. So, Lord, help us to grab a hold of this. Help us to develop it as we look through Mark. And Lord, help it to change our lives so that we can actually say, I've gone all in to follow Jesus. Amen.